Today's video is on why so many women don't realize they have adult ADHD until adulthood. Have you ever wondered, how did no one realize I had ADHD? Maybe you did well in school. Maybe you weren't hyperactive. Maybe everyone described you as smart, responsible, quiet, or just a little anxious. And then one day you watched a video, read an article, or your child was diagnosed, and suddenly your whole life started making sense. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Today, we're talking about why ADHD in women is so often missed and why getting the right diagnosis can change your life. One of the biggest reasons so many women weren't diagnosed with ADHD as children is because for a long time we were looking for the wrong picture. When most people thought about ADHD, they pictured a little boy, the child who couldn't sit still, who was constantly running around the classroom, blurting out answers before the teacher even finished asking the question, interrupting other students, getting sent to the principal's office. That became the picture everyone recognized. Parents recognized it, teachers recognized it, doctors recognized it, and because that's what people expected ADHD to look like, many girls were never considered. Not because they didn't have ADHD, but because their symptoms often looked very different. Many girls weren't climbing on desks. They weren't getting into trouble every day. In fact, many were trying incredibly hard to do the exact opposite. They wanted to do well. They wanted to please their teachers. They wanted to fit in. So instead of acting out, they often worked twice as hard to hide the fact they were struggling. From the outside, they looked like they had it together, but on the inside, they were exhausted, overwhelmed, wondering why everything seemed harder for them than it did for everyone else. And because they weren't disrupting the classroom, no one stopped to ask, could this be ADHD? Instead, many girls heard things like, she's just shy, she's a daydreamer, she's emotional, she's anxious, she just needs to apply herself. Some of those girls weren't diagnosed until their 30s, 40s, or even later. Not because they suddenly developed ADHD, but because no one recognized what it looked like when they were children. So if girls weren't climbing on desks or constantly getting into trouble, what did ADHD actually look like in many of them? Let's talk about that next. So if girls weren't running around the classroom, what did ADHD often look like? Well, if someone came into my office and asked me that question, I'd probably answer it by sharing some of the stories I've heard over the years. Not one person's story, but themes that come up again and again. One woman might tell me, Robin, I've always felt like I was working harder than everyone else. She made good grades. She turned in assignments. People assumed school came naturally to her. What no one saw was that she spent 3 hours on homework that took someone else 1. Or that she had to reread the same page because her mind kept wandering. Another woman might say, everyone thought I was so organized. But then we dig a little deeper. She wasn't organized because organization came naturally. She was organized because she developed systems just to keep her head above water. Color-coded calendars, sticky notes everywhere, 10 alarms on her phone. List reminding her to look at other lists. Those weren't signs that everything was easy. Those were survival strategies. Someone else might ask me, I've always been so hard on myself. If she forgot something, she didn't think, oops, I forgot. She thought, what's wrong with me? One missed deadline, one forgotten permission slip, one late bill, and suddenly she was questioning her intelligence, her character, even her worth. And then there are those women who say, I've always been emotional. Not because they wanted to be, but because after spending all day trying to keep it together, sometimes there was nothing left. The smallest disappointment, a change in plans, a critical comment, and all the effort they had spent holding everything together came pouring out. And then there are those women who spent years trying to be invisible. They weren't disrupting the classroom. They weren't getting into trouble. They were watching everyone else trying to figure out the rules, trying not to say the wrong thing, trying not to forget something, trying not to stand out, because they had learned that if they worked just a little harder, maybe no one would notice how difficult everything felt. The truth is, there isn't one female ADHD personality. Some girls are outgoing, some are quiet, some talk constantly, some hardly speak at all, some are in straight A's, others struggle academically, some are athletes, some are artists, some have anxiety, some don't. That's why ADHD can be so difficult to recognize. It's not defined by one personality, one report card, or one behavior. It's about understanding the pattern of how someone's brain processes attention, organization, motivation, emotions, and executive functioning over time. And when you finally step back and look at the whole picture, things that never seemed connected suddenly start making sense. So, if these women have been living with ADHD all along, why weren't so many diagnosed until their 30s, 40s, or even later? Let's talk about why that happens. One of the biggest questions I hear is, Robin, if I had ADHD my whole life, why wasn't I diagnosed until I was 35 or 45 or 55? And the answer is actually something I see all the time. Many women didn't suddenly develop ADHD. Life has simply become more complicated. Think about childhood for a moment with me. When you're a child, someone else is doing a lot of executive functioning for you. Your parents remind you to brush your teeth. They tell you when it's time to leave. They sign permission slips. They schedule your doctor's appointments. They make sure your dinner is on the table. Your teachers tell you when your assignments are due. The school bell tells you when to change classes. There's structure almost everywhere you go. Even if you're struggling, someone else is helping hold everything together. Then adulthood happens, and slowly the supports disappear. Now you're the one who's supposed to remember everything. You have to pay bills, appointments to schedule, laundry that somehow never ends, meal planning, grocery shopping, remembering birthdays, returning phone calls, keeping track of medications, managing a career, maybe taking care of children or aging parents, or both at the same time. And suddenly, it isn't just one or two things your brain has to manage, it's hundreds. Every single day, many women tell me, I don't know what happened. I used to have everything together. And I gently remind them, maybe you didn't lose your ability to cope. Maybe life simply started asking your brain to juggle more than it ever had before. Then another major life change happens. Some women notice their symptoms after getting married, others after becoming parents, some during college, some when they step into leadership roles at work, others during premenopause or menopause when changing hormone levels can make ADHD symptoms feel even more noticeable. Each new responsibility adds another ball to keep up in the air. Eventually, something has to give. And that's often the moment people begin wondering, why does everyone else seem to be handling this better than I am? Or, why am I working twice as hard just to keep up? Those questions don't mean you failed. They don't mean you're lazy. And they certainly don't mean you're not intelligent. Sometimes they're the first clues that your brain has been working overtime for years. When women finally receive the right diagnosis, one of the most common things I hear isn't relief, it's grief. Grief for the years they spent believing they were careless, lazy, unmotivated, or somehow just not enough. But right alongside that grief comes something incredibly powerful: understanding. Because when you finally understand why things have felt harder, you stop blaming yourself and you can finally start building strategies that work with your brain instead of constantly fighting against it. And here's another reason so many women are missed. We spent years talking about ADHD as a disorder of attention, but attention is only one piece of the story. Let's talk about some of the symptoms that surprise people the most. One of the biggest misconceptions about ADHD is right there in the name: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Because when people hear that, they think, oh, so you just have trouble paying attention? But if you've watched this far, you probably already know it's so much bigger than that. If someone came into my office and said, Robin, I can spend 6 hours researching the perfect vacuum cleaner, but I can't get myself to answer one email, I wouldn't immediately think you have an attention problem. I would think your brain is having difficulty regulating attention. Attention isn't absent. Sometimes it's almost impossible to focus. Other times it's impossible to stop focusing. But ADHD doesn't stop there. It affects something called executive functioning. Think of executive functioning as your brain's management system. It's what helps you decide when to start, figure out what matters most, manage your time, shift between tasks, regulate emotions, control impulses, remember what you're supposed to be doing, and finish what you started. When the system isn't working efficiently, life can feel overwhelming. Not because you're incapable, but because your brain is working much harder to do the things other people may not even think about. Maybe you've looked at a sink full of dishes and wanted to do them, but your brain couldn't figure out where to begin. Maybe you put off making one phone call for 3 weeks, not because you didn't care, but because getting started felt impossible. Maybe you lost track of time, thinking 5 minutes had passed when it had actually been an hour. Maybe someone gave you some constructive feedback, and although they meant to be helpful, it felt deeply personal. You spent the rest of the day replaying the conversation, wondering if you had disappointed them. Or maybe you've held yourself to impossible high standards, thinking, if I can't do it perfectly, I shouldn't do it at all. Over time, people begin to explain these experiences the only way they know how. They tell themselves, I'm lazy, I'm so disorganized, why can't I get it together? Everyone else can do this. Maybe I'm just broken. But here's what I want you to hear. These thoughts are not a diagnosis. They're a conclusion that you've reached after years of struggling to explain experiences that no one else seemed to understand. What if, instead of asking, what's wrong with me, you started asking, what is my brain struggling to do? Because those are two very different questions. One leads to shame, the other leads to understanding. And understanding is where change begins. Unfortunately, while women don't recognize ADHD, or when people around them don't recognize it, those struggles are often mistaken for something else. So let's talk about why so many people are diagnosed with anxiety or depression first, even when ADHD has been there all along. One of the reasons ADHD is often missed in women is because many of the symptoms overlap with other mental health conditions. If someone came into my office and said, Robin, my mind never stops. I overthink everything. I'm constantly worried that I'm going to forget something. You might immediately think that sounds like anxiety. And it might be, but what if she's anxious because she spent years forgetting appointments, losing important things, missing deadlines, or feeling like she's always one step behind? In that case, the anxiety may be very real. But ADHD may also be part of the picture. Or maybe someone says, I'm exhausted. I can't get myself to do anything. I'm overwhelmed by simple tasks. That can absolutely be depression, but it can be someone whose executive functioning has been working overtime for years. Someone who's mentally exhausted from trying so hard just to keep up. And then there are those women who tell me, I replay conversations in my head. I check things over and over. I need everything to feel just right. Sometimes that's obsessive compulsive disorder. Sometimes it's anxiety. Sometimes it's something entirely different. And sometimes those conditions exist alongside ADHD. The same is true for trauma. Many women have experienced difficult or traumatic events, and trauma can affect concentration, memory, emotions, sleep, and ability to stay organized. These symptoms can look very similar to ADHD, but they aren't necessarily the same thing. And here's the part I think is so important. This isn't about deciding, is it ADHD or anxiety? Is it ADHD or depression? Sometimes the answer is both. I've cared for many patients who have had ADHD and anxiety, ADHD and depression, ADHD and OCD, ADHD and a history of trauma. Mental health isn't a multiple choice test where you can only have one answer. That's why I always encourage people not to diagnose themselves based on one video, one checklist, or one social media post. A good mental health evaluation doesn't just ask, what symptoms do you have? It asks, when did they begin? How have they changed over time? What was childhood like? How are those symptoms affecting your work, your relationships, your daily life? Because getting the diagnosis right changes everything. Not because a label defines you, but because the right diagnosis leads to the right treatment, and the right treatment gives you the better chance to feel better. Not because a label defines you, but because the right diagnosis leads to the right treatment, and the right treatment gives you the best chance to feel better. So, what happens when someone finally gets the right diagnosis after years of wondering, why am I like this? For many women, the answer is something they never expected. It's not just relief, sometimes it's grief. So let's talk about that. If someone came into my office and said, Robin, what happens if I finally find out what's been going on? I'd probably smile because I've had that conversation many times. And here's what's interesting. The first emotion usually isn't excitement, it's relief. Relief that there's finally an explanation. Relief they're not lazy. Relief they're not just broken. Relief that maybe, just maybe, they've been carrying around the wrong story about themselves for years. But then something else shows up. Grief. Grief for the child who struggled in school and thought she was smart enough. Grief for the opportunities she believes that she missed. Grief for the years she spent criticizing herself, when what she really needed was understanding. As a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, one of the most rewarding parts of my job isn't giving someone a diagnosis. It's watching the relief on their face when they finally understand themselves. Whether the answer is ADHD, anxiety, depression, OCD, trauma, or a combination of these conditions, understanding what is really going on is the first step toward getting the right treatment. But something incredible happens. People stop asking what's wrong with me, and they start asking, what does my brain need? That one question changes everything, because now, instead of fighting yourself, you can finally start working with yourself. One thing I always want people to understand is this: treatment is about so much more than medication. Medication can be life-changing for many people, but medication isn't the whole treatment plan. The goal simply isn't to improve attention. The goal is to improve your quality of life. For some people, medication is an important piece of the puzzle. For others, therapy helps them understand years of self-criticism and developing healthier ways of thinking. Some people benefit from ADHD coaching, learning practical strategies for organization, planning, and follow-through. And many people notice a huge difference when they improve their sleep, exercise regularly, or create routines that reduce the number of decisions they have to make every day. Sometimes it's something as simple as using phone reminders instead of trying to remember everything, keeping your keys in the same place every day, using one calendar instead of 3, creating external structure instead of expecting your brain to keep track of everything internally. And one treatment I wish every person received is self-compassion. Because after years of believing I should be able to do this, everyone else can, why can't I? Learning to speak to yourself with kindness can be just as important as any medication I prescribe. If you spent years believing I'm lazy, I'm irresponsible, I'm just not trying hard enough, I'm failing, please hear me when I say this. Those labels are not diagnoses. They're conclusions that you've made while trying to explain experiences that no one helped you understand. You deserve answers. You deserve to be heard. And you deserve a comprehensive evaluation that looks at the whole picture, not just one symptom. If someone came into my office and asked, "Robin, what happens if I finally understand my brain?" I would tell them, that's where healing begins. Not because everything suddenly becomes easy, not because life logically becomes organized, and not because you'll never struggle again. Healing begins because you stopped fighting the way your brain works, and you started learning how to work with it. You stopped measuring yourself against everyone else, and you begin building a life that works for you. I truly believe understanding yourself is one of the greatest gifts that you can give yourself, because understanding replaces shame with hope. If this video made you stop and think, that sounds like me, I'd love to hear from you. When did you first begin wondering that ADHD might explain your experiences? Or if you were diagnosed later in life, what was that moment like for you? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might read your comment and realize I'm not alone. If you found this video helpful, please take a minute to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share it with someone who has spent years wondering why life seemed harder than it looked for everyone else. You can also follow me on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok for my evidence-based mental health education that's easy to understand. And if you live in North Carolina and you're looking for a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation or ongoing mental health treatment, you can learn more about my practice by visiting the website linked below. And remember, the right treatment starts with the right diagnosis, and the right diagnosis starts by asking the right questions. Until next time, be kind to your mind.